So welcome to you all, great to see you, and for anybody who's watching on Catch Up, welcome to you too. As you know, I've been doing a series on various attributes, part of the character of God, and trying to understand who he is. Particularly trying to tackle maybe some of the more controversial things about God, and none more so than this morning. I guess if we were to take a straw poll on part of the character of God we'd like to get rid of, if we could possibly do that, then I guess probably the most popular one would be God's anger. We don't have many talks on the anger of God, but I'm going to attempt it this morning, and hopefully it might help us to understand it. That's my aim anyway. Sometimes known as the wrath of God. I mean, that sounds even worse, doesn't it? The wrath of God. We maybe think that we want to send God on an anger management course, because there's a lot about the wrath of God in the Bible, not just in the Old Testament actually, but quite a lot in the New Testament. Jesus mentions it. Paul talks about it a lot in his letters. But I hope that by the end of the talk, this is the aim anyway, by the end of the talk, that maybe you'll be a little bit more at ease with the wrath, the anger of God. Because it is part of his nature, and God is complex. We don't fully understand him. He's beyond our understanding, and it's a lifetime and an eternity actually understanding all of the nuances of who God is and how he works and how he thinks. But it is part of his nature, so I'm going to attempt to, as I say, to enlighten us a bit on it this morning. So I've got some readings. Yeah, it is working. This is good. So this is God's first great description of himself to Moses, who's just been on Mount Sinai receiving the tablets of stone. And he says he passed in front of Moses proclaiming, the Lord, this is who I am, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. And then from Romans 1, Paul says, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God, is plain to them, because God has made it plain. And then lastly from John's Gospel, this is John the Baptist actually talking about Jesus. He says, whoever believes in the Son has eternal life, but whoever rejects the Son will not see life, for God's wrath remains on them. Okay. I've attempted a definition. I don't know how theologically accurate this is, but anyway, this is my best attempt. That his anger is his passionate opposition to evil and sin, and his action in punishing evil. And that's particularly key, that last bit. So I'll just read that again. His passionate opposition to evil and sin, and his action in punishing evil. So I want to start with some misunderstandings about God's anger. First, I guess, is that God is angry by default. Now, sadly, religion and the church has often portrayed this, that somehow God it's his nature to be a bit angry. I had a step grandfather who was on my dad's side. My dad's mum had remarried, his first husband had died. And we used to go and visit him every Sunday back when I was a kid, both my grandma and my step-granddad. And I would say that his natural disposition was that he was grumpy. That was his default position. Okay, so if he went one day and he was slightly more, chipper, it would, what's wrong with him? What's going on? he was a bit grumpy. Now, I just want to point out that he wasn't a blood relative. He was my step grandfather, so it hasn't passed down the genes. Okay, just in case you were worried. But for many of us, actually, when we think of God, and certainly if you are thinking out in the world, if you ask people, probably they would think that God's default position is that he's angry. If I can quote from the Incredible Hulk, as you do sometimes. The Incredible Hulk once said, "I don't get angry, I'm always angry." And maybe that's just how we think of God. And so we think that maybe God is angry and we have to work hard to change that. We have to work hard to sort of make him be a bit nicer and appease him. But I want to say it's rather the other way around, that God's natural disposition is one of loving kindness, forgiveness. And you have to actually work hard to make him angry. That's to quote John Mark Comer, he once said that. You have to work hard to make God angry. And going back to that, if I can go back to that. Sorry, a lot of clicking back here. Back to this. His first and most quoted in the Old Testament, actually, description of God. I see this as a bit like a pair of scales, really. Or if you prefer, as an accountant, a balance sheet, where one side is weighing down far higher than the other. And the Lord says, I'm compassionate. It's on the scales on this side. I'm gracious. Or over there, I'm slow to anger. And then, I'm abounding in love. And I'm faithful. And I'm maintaining love to thousands. It's weighing this scale down and down and down. I want to forgive. And I want to forgive wickedness and rebellion and sin. That's my disposition. I want to do that. But if I won't leave the guilty unpunished. So there's this sort of weighing down on the balance sheet. It's far higher on one side. It's in profit by miles and thousands than the other side. It's God saying, look, my natural disposition is I want to show love. I want to be faithful. I want to forgive. That's who I am. That's my nature. If I can ever find a way of doing it, I will. But yet, I'm really, really, really slow to anger. But the anger is there, and we'll think about that a bit more. If we know that the greatest picture of God is Jesus. The New Testament, as we've said in this, describes Jesus as the exact representation of God's being. He's the exact representation of the Father. And as you read the Gospels, I don't think that you describe Jesus as an angry young man, really. I mean, he does get angry, but it's very rare. It's slow to anger. And we'll talk about when he does get angry in a bit. But Jesus is, he wants to show compassion. And particularly, he was criticised because he showed love and compassion to prostitutes and tax collectors and all the bad people of his time. But that's who God is. I love the book of, I've been reading recently the book of Jonah again. And it's a really, really interesting, fascinating book, brilliantly written, actually. And the story of Jonah is that God asks him to go and preach to Nineveh, one of the major cities of Assyria, which was basically Israel's enemy at the time. And Jonah doesn't want to do it, of course, so he runs away and he gets swallowed up by the fish, and eventually he has to go to, God doesn't let him off the hook, and he goes and he preaches to Nineveh, and they all repent. And in the final chapter, Jonah complains to God and says, I want to die. He said, because I knew you were going to do this, he said. I knew if I went and preached and they repented, you'd forgive them. I knew you would do that. Why have you done that? I want you to kill them. He's saying basically, you're too kind, God. It's this brilliantly inverted story of prophecy. His complaint was that God wasn't angry enough. He really was. He says, come on, you've let my enemies off. God just is not, if I move it back on again. He's not angry by default. He's He's love by default. And we need to remember that. Secondly, we confuse God's anger for ours. The Bible, really because it has to, uses what theologians call anthropomorphisms to describe God. In other words, it's language that describes him in human ways. So when it says that God is sometimes angry, we can often think that he shows his anger in the way that we do. Now, anger isn't always wrong, as we'll come to say in a minute, but it's how you deal with anger that is the problem. And God never deals with his anger in a way that is like so often we do, because often our anger is basically because our will or our desires have been thwarted or somebody's done something to us. God's anger is never about himself. He doesn't get angry because somebody says something about him or does something personally to him. That was shown again by Jesus. He never got angry about the stuff that happened to him. He had every right to, really, but he didn't. So God's anger is not like ours, or the way that we often show it. It's not rash. It's not selfish. It's never disproportionate like ours is. We up the ante with somebody when somebody does something, they hurt our finger, we want to cut their arm off, or, whatever it is. That was, part of the Old Testament eye for an eye business, because that's how we do as human beings. We want to up the ante with our anger. He's not vengeful. He's not out of control. He's not passive aggressive. He's not thinking, oh, if so-and-so's done that, I'm just not going to talk to them. I'm not going to have anything to do with them for 3 months. He's not passive aggressive. He's not moody. He's not petty. He's not cruel. He's not vindictive. There is no dark side to God's anger. I deliberately wanted to do last week's talk about God being light and that there is no darkness in him before I did this, because there's no dark side to God's anger. So I think we can say that it's always measured, it's always appropriate, it's always right, his anger, it's wise, it's just. It's actually redemptive, I think. I think it aims to be redemptive for us. It's patient. It's never personally motivated, as I've said. It's beneficial. It's revelatory. He's trying to reveal something to us through his anger. And it is tinged with mercy. And always, I think, when God's angry, there's always a tear in his eye about it. So don't confuse God's anger with ours. It works in a completely different way. It doesn't work in the way that our anger so often works. The third misunderstanding is that we think somehow that his anger is incompatible with his love. But actually, anger is not incompatible with love. And anger in itself is often a right emotion to feel. It's just what you do with it that's the problem. If you found out that your partner was having an affair, then love and anger will be there together, but it's what you do with it. Actually, the opposite, the real danger would be indifference. If you found out that your husband or wife was having an affair and you were completely indifferent, so, I don't care. That's the problem. Right, anger is the right thing. It's what you then do with it. So anger is not incompatible with God's love. It's part of his love, actually. So it's in your anger, do not sin, as Paul once said in Ephesians chapter 4. It's what you do with it. So those are 3 perhaps common misunderstandings: that God is angry by default. We confuse God's anger with how we do, how we react to anger and display anger. We think his anger is incompatible with love, but it's not. Okay. So moving on, I want to say that theologians often say that God's anger is actually judicial. And what that means is it's always linked to his justice. This is again from Romans, this is chapter 2. Paul says, "But because of your stubbornness and your unrepentant heart," he's talking about, Jews and Gentiles that are apart from God, "you are storing up wrath against yourself the day of God's wrath, when his righteous judgment will be revealed. You see the link there between the wrath, the day of judgment. And interestingly, you can see the link even more clearly when this is Romans 13, where Paul is talking about obeying the authorities, the Roman authorities in his day. And he says this: for the one in authority, the Roman governor, is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath. Do you notice that? Agents of wrath, to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. What Paul is saying there is that the judicial system, when it's working well, of course it's subject to man's fallibility and corruption, but when it's working well, it's an agent of God's wrath. In other words, it's that sense of God punishing and seeing that wrong is punished and appropriately. So you know how today, often, well recently, they've started to televise judges passing sentence, particularly in famous or more notorious cases, and we've probably seen them on the news. That's the judge there in that moment when he's passing sentence is passing on the wrath of the nation, if you like. The nation that's saying, this, what you've done is wrong. It needs to be punished. It needs to be recognised as wrong and punished. And that, in that moment, although, often the judge will be very calm, he'll be summing up, he'll be saying what you've done, he's displaying the wrath of the United Kingdom in that moment. And that's how God's wrath works. It's his moment when he displays his judgment and his justice for what has happened to us. So it's the punishment of evil that is his wrath. That's his anger. Okay, so hopefully we're getting further on. Are you still tracking with me? Good. So what makes God angry? This is the Romans passage. The wrath of God is being revealed. That's interesting, that it's actually already at work in our world. That's what Paul is saying. It's being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people. So the things that make God angry is firstly godlessness, which is an interesting thought, actually. We often think of the second one, we'll think about of wickedness. But it's not living with any reference to God in your life. Living without him, seeking happiness and pursuit of life without trust in God, without recognition of who he is. That's part of Paul's argument in Romans 1, is that we're all without excuse because God has revealed his nature in the world around us. And then to live life as if he didn't exist and wasn't there. He says that's part of the problem, without God, without loving him. But also, in terms of wickedness, which is, I think, living selfishly against one another. And it's those two great commandments, when Jesus was asked, what's the great commandment? Love of God, love your neighbour. And it's not doing either of those things, godlessness and wickedness. And that is our natural human condition, of course, without God, is that's how we live. We live without him. We live, to one degree or another, selfishly, wanting to do things for ourselves more than we want to love our neighbours and friends and see them thrive. And so, of course, what makes God angry is the result of the above. And we see it in so many different ways worked out, the fracturing of our world. So in rape and murder, abuse, oppression, human trafficking, greed, destruction, violence, injustice, idolatry, theft, just plain indifference sometimes, exploitation of others, all the isms, racism, sexism, ageism, whatever ism you like to think of. All of those things. And quite frankly, as I've thought about this, if God isn't angry with a lot of the stuff that's happening in our world, he's not a God I want to know, actually. It's right that he is angry. We should be angry. Not in a destructive way, but in and that's the hard thing. We find it very hard not to get angry in a destructive way. And I have to say, of course, as well, that God seems to get particularly angry at the abuse of religion. Looking again at Jesus' life, the times when he got angry wasn't with the sinners, it was with the religious elite. It was, the time when he overturned the money changers in the temple, when religious abuse and the kind of those that should know better were stopping people actually coming to God, making it harder. That does annoy him. Don't do it. So when we make it harder for people to come to Jesus as Christians, not a good place. That's why he said, it's better to have a millstone thrown around your neck and tossed into the sea. He loved hyperbole, Jesus, but, rather than to stop any one of these little ones of mine coming to me. Right. So that's what makes God angry. And what finally, even with a tear in his eye, if he had an eye, even with a tear in his eye, he will judge that with justice. So how is God's wrath being revealed? Or how will it be revealed? Romans 1:24 says, therefore, as we've been talking about wrath, he says God gave them over, that's mankind. He gives us over to the sinful desires of our hearts. That's how God's wrath is displayed, his anger is displayed. He lets us do what we want. And that's our punishment, actually. He gives us what we want. It reminds me of the prodigal son parable, brilliant theological parable of Jesus's. And you know how the prodigal son goes to his father and says, I want my inheritance now. I wish you were dead. I don't want anything to do with you anymore. I want my inheritance now. And the father gives him it. He answers his prayer. He answers his request. And you know how it plays out. Of course, he goes off, squanders his wealth and comes to the point of absolute desperation where he's feeding pigs and he's got nothing to eat himself. See, the father lets it play out. And the idea of letting it play out is that he does what happens in the parable, is that he says he comes to his senses and says, I'll go back. I'll go back to my father. Even though, he wants to go back on terms of a slave. And we know the story plays out and God receives him back as a son. But there's that answering the prayer, letting him go off, letting him do what he wants to do, and letting him find the consequences of it. And eventually he comes to his senses and goes back. I've got a long quote. It was too long to put up, but it's brilliant. I often quote from Tim Keller, and this is his diagnosis of this, God giving us over to what we desire. He says, the worst thing that can happen to us is that we are given what our hearts over desire. Take a man who worships his career. He serves it as what will make him a somebody. It drives him and it dominates his life. Everything else is fitted around it. The worst thing that can happen to him is promotion, because it allows him to continue to think that he can find blessing in his over-desire for his work and his position. It convinces him that this is real life. It enables him to forget the wreckage he's making of his marriage, his family, his friendships, in order to pursue his God. Oscar Wilde summed it up well. When the gods wish to punish us, they answer our prayers. This is the wrath of God, to give us what we want too much, to give us over to the pursuit of the things we have put in place of him. The worst thing that God can do to human beings in the present is let them reach their idolatrous goals. His judgment is to give us over to the destructive power of idolatry and of evil. When we sin, it sets up stresses and strains in the fabric of the order that God created. Instead of us finding blessing, our sin causes breakdowns spiritually, psychologically, socially, and physically. The great tragedy is that we choose this for ourselves, and God allows us to walk through the door that we've chosen. Absolute brilliance. That's it. He gives us over. And ultimately, when it comes to the day of judgment, it will be about the fact that people are still choosing to live without God. C.S. Lewis once said that God will let everybody into heaven who could stand it. That's a great thought. Because some people will just, even when they're face to face with God the Maker, they will still say, I don't want you in my life. I want to run my life. That's what I want to do. And so he'll let them. And he'll let them depart away from his presence and bear the consequences. But lastly, let me finish with this. When we trust in Jesus, we're no longer under God's wrath. We're no longer under the threat of judgment because Jesus has taken it for us, and we trust him now. We trust him. That verse in John 3 says it really. Whoever believes in the Son has eternal life. Whoever rejects the Son and will not have him will not see life, for God's wrath remains on him. In other words, the judgment still remains, and that judgment of letting them do what they want ultimately will remain. Or as Paul puts it in Ephesians 2, all of us also lived among them, that's the world, at one time, gratifying the cravings of our flesh and following its desires and thoughts. Like the rest, we were by nature deserving of wrath. But because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ, even when we were dead in transgressions. It's by grace that you've been saved. So where it can, mercy will always triumph over judgment. The Father has no desire to judge us. He doesn't want to bring us justice. He wants to free us. As he said, he wants to be that God who forgives rebellion and sin. That's all he's desired. He can find a way, and he found a way through Jesus. And that's the greatest news of all, that he found a way. I know that by nature, I am an object of wrath, as the slightly older NIV version put it. I'm an object of wrath. I'm an object who deserves judgment, a person who deserves judgment. But that will never happen to me now. There's no condemnation, because Jesus has taken it all upon himself. And because we trust in him, we're set free. Mercy triumphs over judgment wherever it can. And for Paul, I think, grace, we recognise that it's something we receive that we don't deserve. But there's actually a power in grace. I think Paul sees grace as a power that's at work in us. And part of that grace that's at work in us is because we understand who we were by nature. It's when we don't really understand the nature of our own rebellion and the darkness of our own hearts and what God has done to change that we don't really allow the power of grace to transform us and change us. When somebody does something to you that you don't deserve, when you receive something that is beyond imagining, it does something to you. You think, it can change you when you receive mercy and love. So that the power of grace is changing us from being who we were into being who we can be and should be and will be in Jesus through his love. I think I'm done.